I watched my manager smile while cutting my bonus, the same smile she used when pretending to care about me. That's the moment it all started. The downfall. The chaos. The sweet, silent revenge. My name's Emily Carter, Senior Financial Analyst at Lexan Dynamics, a mid-sized tech firm that preached integrity louder than it practiced it. I'd been there for 5 years, long enough to know the company's blood type, heartbeat, and every hidden artery that kept it alive. I wasn't just an employee. I was the system behind the system. And her, my manager, Victoria Hale, was the woman who built her empire on charm, manipulation, and other people's work. For years, Victoria had been my mentor. Or at least, that's what I believed. She took me under her wing when I was fresh out of grad school, taught me how to navigate corporate politics, how to speak boardroom, how to smile when swallowing an insult. I admired her fiercely, almost blindly. She was the kind of woman who entered a room like she owned it. Her designer heels clicked in rhythm with authority, her words dripped confidence, and her perfume, jasmine and steel, lingered long after she left. Everyone wanted to be in her favor. Everyone, including me. But over time, I started noticing things. The way she'd take credit for my reports in meetings. The way she'd downplay my ideas, then recycle them weeks later as her own strategic insights. I told myself it didn't matter, that someday she'd recognize my loyalty. I couldn't have been more wrong. The announcement happened on a Friday afternoon. We just closed a massive quarter, numbers that shattered company records. I had pulled 3 all-nighters that month, running financial forecasts, cleaning up data errors from other departments, and building the presentation Victoria would deliver to the CEO. The CEO, Mr. Langford, had congratulated her personally, praising her team's exceptional effort. Victoria gave her rehearsed modest smile and said, "Oh, it was all about leadership and teamwork." That was the first crack in my faith. Still, I waited for Monday, bonus day. Because that was when hard work usually paid off. Victoria called me into her glass-walled office. Her smile looked professional, but her eyes, those sharp, calculating blue eyes, had something else behind them. "Emily, I want to thank you personally for this quarter," she began, folding her hands on the desk. "You've really grown into your role." The board noticed. "Thank you," I said, already feeling the relief flood in. "I'm just glad I could help make the numbers work." She nodded slowly. "About that, we had some budget realignments. Unfortunately, it affected a few departments, including ours." I blinked. "What do you mean?" She sighed, soft and fake. "Your bonus was adjusted." "Adjusted?" "Cut." "Significantly." My heart dropped. "But I exceeded every metric. I handled the audit. I took over Mark's workload when he went on leave, I know." Her tone stayed sugar smooth. "And I truly appreciate it. But leadership had to make tough calls. We're all taking hits." I stared at her. "Are you taking a hit too?" She smiled. "Let's not get personal, Emily." That was when I noticed the new Cartier bracelet on her wrist. I walked out of that office with my throat tight, my hands shaking, and my entire sense of worth dissolving. In the break room, people were whispering about Victoria's record-breaking bonus. Double the usual, apparently. Someone even joked that she'd probably buy another car. That's when the truth hit me. It wasn't budget cuts. It was betrayal. She'd cut mine to pad her own. I went home that night replaying every conversation we'd ever had. Every compliment that had been a leash. Every mentoring moment that had really been manipulation. My apartment felt colder than usual. I poured a glass of wine, stared at the city lights outside my window, and tried to convince myself to move on. "It's corporate life," I muttered. "People do worse things." But deep down, something twisted awake. A small, cold voice I hadn't heard before. It whispered, "She used you." And another voice followed, softer but sharper, "She'll do it again." I didn't know it yet, but that night marked the beginning of the end, not for me, but for her. For the company. For everyone who thought loyalty was weakness. I opened my laptop, just to check one thing. The company's internal financial logs. My domain. My digital kingdom. Everything was still there. Every transaction, every oversight, every little secret Victoria thought she'd buried. My cursor hovered over her name on a confidential expense report. $14,000 in client entertainment, authorized by her. Untraceable, unless you knew where to look. I did. I should have closed the laptop. I should have gone to sleep. But instead, I whispered to myself, let's see how far this really goes. A quiet unease settled in my chest, half fear, half thrill. Because part of me still didn't believe I could ever turn against her. And yet, another part already knew I would. They say when someone betrays you, the signs were always there, you just didn't want to see them. I didn't see them either. Or maybe I did, and I just called them leadership qualities. The Monday after my bonus got cut, I walked into the office pretending everything was fine. My chest felt heavy, but I plastered on the same polite smile everyone else wore when their pride had been quietly stolen. Victoria was already in her office, standing behind her glass desk, sunlight catching her hair like some kind of halo. She looked powerful, untouchable, and suddenly unfamiliar. "Morning, Emily," she called, her tone airy, casual, as if nothing had happened. "Morning," I replied, forcing cheerfulness. She smiled, too wide, too bright. "I hope there are no hard feelings about last week. I really fought for you, you know." I nodded slowly. "Of course." But her eyes didn't match her words. They flickered away before I could read them. That week, something shifted. She started having private meetings with Jason, one of the junior analysts. He was new, barely 6 months in, but she suddenly trusted him with reports that used to be mine. Once, I walked into her office to drop off data sheets and froze when I heard laughter. Her laughter. The kind that used to make me feel proud to earn. When she noticed me at the door, her face stiffened. "Emily. Oh, could you come back later? Jason and I are reviewing a confidential project." Confidential? I was her senior analyst. There was no project she should have been keeping from me. I hesitated. "Sure," I said, stepping back. Her tone softened as she added, "You've got plenty to do, right? Let Jason handle the minor tasks for now. I need you focused on strategy." Strategy. The word felt flattering, but empty. Because when I checked the project files later that day, the access permissions had been changed. Locked. My credentials denied. I sat there, staring at my screen, the words access restricted flashing back at me, and something inside me twisted again. By Wednesday, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. During team meetings, Victoria's tone toward me changed subtly. She'd interrupt my sentences, rephrase my ideas as if to clarify them, or worse, credit them to someone else. Like the time I suggested implementing a new budget tracker. She smiled tightly and said, "That's a great idea, Jason. Let's have you and Emily collaborate on it." Jason blinked, confused, but I just nodded. Everyone around the table nodded too. Because that's what we did, we followed her narrative. I tried telling myself I was overreacting. That maybe she was just grooming Jason for promotion. That it wasn't personal. But my gut told me otherwise. Every time she said we instead of you, every time she ignored my emails or changed deadlines without notice, it felt deliberate. Controlled. That Friday, we had a client presentation. Normally, I'd lead the data section. It was my specialty. But an hour before the meeting, Victoria stopped by my desk. "Emily, I'll have Jason walk through the numbers today," she said smoothly. Fresh perspective. I stared at her. "But I built the model. He doesn't even have the final version." "Oh, I sent it to him this morning. You'll be backup, just in case." Backup. Like a spare tire. I swallowed my frustration. Of course. During the presentation, I watched her from the corner of the room, how she smiled encouragingly at Jason, how she subtly corrected him when he stumbled, how she praised him afterward as if he'd reinvented the financial wheel. And when the client shook hands with her and said, "Impressive work, Victoria," she didn't even glance my way. That night, I sat in my car long after everyone had left, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I barely recognized myself. My eyes looked tired. My jaw clenched. "Maybe I'm paranoid," I whispered. "Maybe she's just managing differently." But deep down, I knew. This wasn't management. It was erasure. The following week confirmed it. Victoria started forgetting to include me in key email threads. Deadlines were moved without my knowledge. When mistakes appeared in reports Jason handled, she blamed me for poor supervision. I tried confronting her once, calmly, respectfully. "Victoria, I feel like something's changed," I said in her office. "I'm not sure if I've done something wrong," but she cut me off with a sigh. "Emily, you're being too sensitive. You've always been emotional about feedback." That stung, because she used to say my emotional intelligence was my strength. "I'm not being emotional," I said carefully. "I just want to understand what's happening." Her lips curved slightly. "What's happening is growth. Maybe you're outgrowing this role. Maybe you're ready for something new." Something new? My promotion track had been frozen for months by her. I left her office that day with my stomach knotted, my trust cracking like thin glass. At home, I couldn't focus. I'd catch myself staring at my laptop, scrolling through company files without really knowing why. Just looking, searching, for proof, for a pattern, for anything that made sense. My instinct screamed that she was hiding something. But then that other voiced doubt crept in. What if you're wrong? What if it's all in your head? I poured another glass of wine and tried to silence the noise. I told myself it was just office politics, that I could fix it if I worked harder. But even as I said it, I felt it, the quiet, invisible shift in the air. The kind of tension that comes before a storm. And for the first time, I wondered if Victoria's smile wasn't just fake. Maybe it was a warning. Betrayal doesn't always come like thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as an email at 2 a.m. That's how I found out. It had been 2 weeks since the red flag started waving. I hadn't slept properly in days, my thoughts constantly orbiting Victoria, her tone, her words, her smiles that now felt like traps. I'd stopped trusting my own instincts. I needed proof. And then, one night, I got it. It was nearly midnight. I was still at the office, finishing end-of-quarter reconciliations. The building was empty except for the hum of air vents and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. I was halfway through the expense reports when I noticed something odd, an authorization log that didn't make sense. Victoria's name was listed on multiple high-value transfers, approved using my digital credentials. At first, I thought it was a system glitch. I cross-checked the timestamps. Every transaction was logged between 9 and 10 a.m. while I was in team meetings. I'd never authorized them. My fingers trembled as I dug deeper. The transfers were marked as supplier reimbursements, but the account numbers didn't match any of our vendors. They traced back to a private shell company, Hale Consulting LLC. Hale. Her last name. I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears. It couldn't be. I opened the company registry database, entered the name, and there it was, Hale Consulting LLC, registered under her husband's name, with Victoria listed as the managing financial advisor. My stomach dropped. The client entertainment expenses. The unexplained budget shifts. The reason she cut my bonus. She wasn't just manipulating the system, she was stealing from it. For a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at the screen. The air around me seemed to disappear. I'd trusted her, defended her, stayed late nights cleaning up her messes. I'd believed every lie she'd fed me about teamwork and sacrifice. And she'd been using my credentials, my name, to cover her fraud. A mix of nausea and rage rose in my throat. I stood up too fast, the chair screeching against the floor. My reflection in the glass wall looked pale and hollow-eyed. "How could you, Victoria?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I replayed every recent conversation, every fake compliment, every time she'd said, "Don't worry, I'll handle the numbers." Now I knew what handling meant. I felt sick. Used. She hadn't just cut my bonus to take the money, she'd cut it to shut me up. To make sure I didn't look too closely at the books. And I'd fallen for it. The next morning, I tried to act normal. She breezed into the office wearing her usual power suit, her hair flawless, her smile effortless. "Morning, Emily," she said. "You look tired." I stared at her, trying not to let my face show the truth I now held. "Just a long night," I replied quietly. She gave a sympathetic nod. "You really need to learn work-life balance. Maybe take a day off next week." Work-life balance. She'd stolen my work and my life. I nodded slowly. Maybe I will. Her eyes flickered briefly, calculating, but she didn't push. I watched her walk away, her heels echoing down the hallway, and something inside me hardened. That evening, I sat at home surrounded by printed spreadsheets, receipts, and transaction logs. My tiny apartment looked like an investigation board. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. She'd been funneling money for nearly a year, hundreds of thousands in marketing reimbursements, contractor payments, client dinners. All routed through fake vendors and approved by credentials belonging to other employees too. She was smart. She'd spread the blame thin, so no one person could be easily accused. But I was the common link. My digital signature appeared most frequently. She'd made me her scapegoat. If this ever surfaced, I'd be the one destroyed. Fired. Blacklisted. Maybe even charged. That's when the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent streams down my face as I stared at the evidence. I felt humiliated. Powerless. Trapped. For years, I'd given everything to this company, to her. I'd sacrificed weekends, birthdays, relationships, because I believed hard work mattered. That loyalty mattered. But in the end, all it got me was betrayal and a shredded reputation waiting to happen. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smile, the same one from the day she cut my bonus. The same one she used while she took everything from me. By dawn, the tears had dried. The fear had settled. What replaced it wasn't grief anymore. It was calm. Cold. Because I realized something. She thought she'd broken me. She thought I'd stay silent, just another loyal, scared employee too afraid to fight. But she'd forgotten one thing. I wasn't just part of the system. I knew the system. I knew where every number lived, every loophole hid, every secret she'd buried to keep herself safe. So if she wanted to play dirty, I could play smarter. I closed my laptop slowly, the morning light spilling through the window. My reflection in the screen didn't look broken anymore. It looked composed. Focused. The kind of calm that comes before a storm. All right, Victoria, I whispered. Game on. When the world betrays you, you have two choices: break or rebuild. For 3 days after discovering Victoria's fraud, I lived like a ghost. I went to work, nodded through meetings, answered emails, but inside, I was hollow. Every word she said felt like poison. Every smile from my coworkers felt like a reminder of how blind I'd been. I couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Because if I accused her without proof, she'd bury me before I could blink. She had power. Influence. Friends in high places. I had nothing but evidence that could still be erased, and a reputation she could easily twist into a lie. That realization haunted me. No one was coming to save me. Not HR. Not the CEO. Not the system I'd believed in. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth of corporate loyalty. It's just fear dressed in a suit. It was Thursday evening when the shift began. I stayed late again, long after everyone left. The city below glowed with the dull orange of streetlights, and in the reflection of my computer screen, I saw my own face, tired, yes, but sharper than before. I opened Victoria's financial folders again, but this time, I didn't cry. I analyzed. Every file, every email trail, every signature she'd falsified. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was building a case. But the more I uncovered, the more something else rose inside me, not just anger, but clarity. She hadn't just stolen money. She'd stolen my belief in fairness, in hard work, in goodness. She made me doubt myself so she could rise higher. And I'd let her. That was the part that hurt the most. At one point, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the city's skyline through the glass. My reflection overlapped with the glowing Lexan Dynamics logo outside. I whispered to myself, she's not the company. You are. That's when it clicked. Victoria might have controlled the faces in the boardroom, but I controlled the data that kept their empire alive. I knew the passwords, the protocols, the files no one else even knew existed. For years, I had been the quiet architect of Lexan's stability. And she'd underestimated that. The next morning, I arrived early. Earlier than usual. The office was still dark, the air cold and silent. I walked straight to the server room, the one place Victoria never bothered with. Her world lived in meetings and handshakes, not in the digital backbone she exploited. I logged in with my admin credentials and created a private backup of every incriminating file I could find. Every falsified invoice, every unauthorized transfer, every document she'd touched under my name. Then I encrypted them into a secure drive, one she couldn't trace or delete. It felt like breathing again. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't reacting to her anymore. I was acting for me. That night, I didn't drink wine. I brewed coffee and opened a blank document. I titled it, The Fall of Victoria Hale. I began writing everything. Not for revenge yet, but to remember. To reclaim the narrative she'd stolen from me. I detailed every conversation, every manipulation, every date and timestamp. It wasn't just evidence, it was therapy. With every word, I felt my fear lose its grip. I realized something powerful. She had taught me everything I needed to destroy her. How to speak boardroom. How to play politics. How to move silently, strategically. She'd just never imagined I'd use it against her. By Sunday morning, I stood by my apartment window, watching the sun rise. My notebook lay open on the desk beside me, filled with plans, timelines, and names. I wasn't naive anymore. I knew this wouldn't be easy. Taking her down meant risking everything, my job, my reputation, even my safety. But something inside me had shifted forever. The scared employee who once waited for approval was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd finally understood that silence is just another way to surrender. That afternoon, I went for a walk downtown. I passed by Lexon's headquarters, towering glass and metal, reflecting the sky like it belonged to something divine. For years, I'd thought of it as my second home. Now, it just looked like a fortress built on lies. And I was ready to burn it down. Not literally, but strategically. Patiently. With precision. Like the analyst I was trained to be. Back at home, I drafted my next steps. I would collect full evidence of her embezzlement. Identify her cover-up network inside Lexon. Create a trail, visible enough to trigger suspicion at the executive level. Time everything so that when it collapsed, she couldn't point the blame anywhere but herself. Each step brought a strange, steady calm. This wasn't about revenge anymore. Not entirely. It was about justice. About taking back control of my story and making sure no one could ever erase me again. I closed my notebook, exhaled deeply, and said aloud, "You took everything from me, Victoria. But you forgot one thing." A small smile tugged at my lips. "You trained me too well." The fear that had once kept me quiet was gone. What remained was quiet determination, the kind that doesn't need to shout. Because I wasn't planning to fight her with anger. I was going to fight her with intelligence. With strategy. With fire hidden beneath calm eyes. Revenge doesn't wear a mask. It wears a timetable. For the first few days after I decided to act, I moved like a ghost inside my own life, present, unobtrusive, listening. Victoria didn't notice. That was the point. She thought I was broken, exhausted, too beaten to fight. She sat back and polished her trophies while I built a quiet war room. My apartment became evidence central. My laptop hummed like a second heartbeat. Sticky notes with dates and amounts clustered on the wall. The folders on my desk were organized not by urgency, but by leverage. People she trusted, invoices that didn't add up, email chains with convenient gaps. Every piece had to fit. Step 1 was obvious: secure the proof. I already had a private backup of suspect transfers and shell company payments, but paper and pixels alone weren't enough. I needed corroboration, voices, witnesses, a pattern that an auditor couldn't dismiss as coincidence. So I started where she'd never look, the people she considered expendable. I made small, casual conversations with junior staff, late-night coffee runs, "Hallway, how are you?" and watched for cracks. People talk when they believe the danger is gone, when they think no one hears. Jason, the kid she'd been grooming, was too green to be useful. He still idolized her. But others, an overworked contractor who'd been paid late, an admin who handled invoices, were full of stray details. Names. Dates. A comment about a dinner that never happened. Whispered, she told me to mark it as client hospitality. I scribbled everything down, not with accusation but curiosity. I asked questions that sounded innocent. Do you remember that vendor from June? Which account was that under? I posed hypotheticals, letting them fill in the blanks. People are unreliable allies when their memory is clouded by fear, unless you give them permission to speak. I offered that permission without dramatics. No speeches. No promises. Just listening. Step 2. Create safe exposure points. If Victoria had a network, I needed to break it gently, not shatter it all at once. Small, unnerving revelations could rattle the board without tipping my hand. I arranged for a few discreet mistakes to surface, an invoice mysteriously readdressed to a different vendor, a reimbursement email forwarded to an uninvolved manager. Nothing irreversible, just enough to seed doubt. How? With technicality and timing. I used my admin access to flag transactions with internal notes that suggested review. I changed metadata timestamps on trivial documents to show unusual activity during meetings. Anyone who saw it would think, odd, who's been touching this? The goal wasn't to point fingers. It was to make the ledger cough. Every move was calibrated. I never accessed anything that could be traced back to me. The backup remained off-site and encrypted. I kept conversations off company channels. I used burner emails and anonymous tips to HR, carefully phrased, factual, non-accusatory. There appears to be an inconsistency in vendor X's billing, read 1. Could finance review? HR would treat it as a procedural request. They'd open a ticket. That ticket, in turn, would prompt an internal inquiry. Small ripples. Step 3. Leverage relationships. Victoria's strength was reputation. She cultivated allies, executives who benefited from her leadership, board members who loved her polished presentations. Reputation is fragile when someone else holds the receipts. I quietly fed select, impartial actors with redacted summaries of what I'd found, outside counsel at a boutique audit firm, a former compliance officer who'd left Lexan with contempt. I didn't tell them who I was. I told them the trail. Professionals smell patterns. They don't need names to get curious. Emotionally, this part was the hardest. I rehearsed the old version of me, the eager protege. I smiled in meetings, praised her ideas when deserved, and kept my tone neutral. I ate lunch at my desk while my wall of notes grew. I flattered her in just the right way to keep her comfortable around me, a compliment here, a supportive nod there. She rewarded me with small mercies, a delegated budget review, a seat at a meeting because she truly believed I had been broken. That complacency was my ally. I also set emotional traps. If she was counting on my silence, I would force the silence to feel dangerous to her. I made a point of discovering minor invoice errors in public, something that would make her politely correct me, letting me observe her reaction. When she lied or deflected, I stored it. Every flinch, every corrective smile, every thin excuse became another stitch in the fabric I was weaving to cover her. Timing was everything. Expose too early and she'd bury the evidence. Wait too long and she might cover her tracks. I created a launch window, a quarter-end report cycle when spreadsheets get scrutinized and senior staff are distracted by numbers. Auditors would be in, eyes sharp. I could seed questions so they'd arise naturally during reviews. At the heart of the plan was one brutal truth: I could make the company see without ever directly accusing her. If a critical mass of anomalies formed, vendor red flags, payment discrepancies, unusual approvals, the system itself would demand answers. My job was to orchestrate the anomalies and stay invisible while they unfolded. There was risk. There was the constant hum of dread that I would be discovered. Sometimes, in the quiet after midnight, that dread became a physical ache. I'd think of my career, of what I'd lose if I failed. I'd imagine Victoria smiling in courtrooms, in boardrooms, handing me the blame. The old fear was never far. But then I'd read a line from my notebook, her exact words from the day she cut my bonus, and the ache would harden into resolve. She had taken my money, my credit, my trust. Now I would take her alibi. The plan moved forward like a chess game. And while Victoria polished her trophies, she remained blissfully convinced I was shattered. Beneath the calm surface, I was setting the pieces for a checkmate that would expose everything she'd hidden and, if I timed it right, topple the empire she'd built on other people's names. I closed my notebook and looked at the wall of notes. Each line was a promise. Each name was a step toward clearing my name and making her answer for what she'd done. Outside, Lexan's lights glowed late into the evening. Inside, I breathed, steady and small. The first trap was almost in place. I had rehearsed the moment 100 times in my head, the exact cadence of my confession, how my voice would hold steady, the instant the room's air would change. But when it finally arrived, it wasn't a confession at all. It was a surgical reveal, clean, factual, and impossible to deny. It began on an ordinary Thursday, the kind of gray morning where even the elevators felt sluggish. Auditors from an external firm had been quietly invited in under the guise of a routine review. They'd found the first of my planted anomalies, flagged invoices, misaligned payment timestamps, vendor accounts that didn't quite exist. What started as curiosity turned into a forensic sweep. I watched from the perimeter as the boardroom filled. Victoria sat at the head of the table, flawless as ever, radiating confidence like heat. She had no idea the game had already moved beyond her control. She would learn, calmly and publicly, how little control ever meant. The first hammer fell when the auditors presented their preliminary findings. The slide deck was clinical line items, transaction trails, IP addresses, and the shell company connections. There was no music, no soundtrack, just the quiet clicking of a remote and the low hum of the projector. Each slide landed like a fact you couldn't unhear. Victoria's face flickered for the first time, not panic, but calculation. She smiled once, thinly, as if she could still negotiate the narrative. Then the email chain I'd preserved, the one showing her approvals under my credentials, played like a whispered confession. The auditors called for an immediate compliance meeting. Cameras were allowed in. Words like embezzlement, insider manipulation, and fraud started curling around the room like smoke. I had not stood up. I didn't need to. The evidence was loud enough. What followed was procedural, painfully efficient. The CEO, pale and bewildered, tried to distance himself, insisting this was limited to a rogue actor. The press smelled blood. Within hours, Lexan's stock, already volatile in whispers, began to tumble as investor confidence dropped. Phone calls that used to be polite turned sharp and terrifying. Major clients paused contracts pending investigation. Funds were frozen until auditors could confirm exposures. Victoria was escorted out under the guise of a private meeting, and the media narrative did the rest. Within a day, every outlet that mattered carried the story. Senior manager implicated in fraud, company under review. Her allies, who had once smiled with her in gala photos, now kept their distance like people avoiding broken glass. But the real coup wasn't the headlines. It was how the financial dominoes fell in sequence. Clients delayed payments. Banks withdrew lines of credit. Creditors who once vied for Lexan's attention began to whisper about risk. The balance sheet, so carefully massaged, could not hide what was coming. Liquidity evaporated faster than anyone could plug it. The board convened emergency meetings, desperate to reassure stakeholders, but assurance is a fragile currency when trust is gone. I remember standing in the corridor outside the executive suite as the final signatories signed off on a disclosure to regulators. My stomach felt hollow and oddly light at the same time. People were crying in clusters, employees who had nothing to do with the fraud but were suffocating under its fallout. I'd imagined celebration, but victory was quieter. It tasted like metal and winter air. When creditors finally issued the ultimatum, withdraw funding unless an immediate capital injection arrived, the company had nowhere to turn. Investors walked. The stock plummeted to levels that made earlier numbers look fictional. Within a week, lexiconic phrases no one wants in a corporate life, Chapter 11, insolvency, forced liquidation, entered every email thread. Victoria's public fall was swift. Her house of interviews crumbled into a few terse statements and then silence. Her accounts were frozen, her assets under review. She was removed from the company, escorted out with the same composure she once used to dismiss others. I'd imagined her shrieking and bargaining, anything dramatic to make the story feel cinematic. Instead, she walked like someone who had prepared for every outcome except the one where she had no allies left. The bankruptcy filing was the final, impossible punctuation. Lexan Dynamics, a place I had called home, a machine I had helped run, announced it couldn't meet its obligations. Offices emptied. Servers went dark. The building that had reflected the skyline now just mirrored the sky's gray indifference. People asked me later if I felt triumphant when the papers printed the headlines. If I danced when the final gavel came down. The truth sat somewhere else entirely. I felt relief, an enormous, trembling thing, because the person who almost buried me could no longer hide. I felt sorrow, too, for the dozens of loyal people whose lives unraveled because of one person's greed. The irony was bitter. In exposing the rot, I'd also exposed the whole organism that depended on it. Companies are not monsters, they are collections of humans. And humans suffer when institutions collapse. I stood in the empty boardroom for a long time after the last employee packed up a box from their desk. The evening sun cut across the long table in a stripe of pale light. Dust motes hung like confetti. I ran my fingers over the glossy wood where once deals were sealed with a handshake and a smile. Victoria never confronted me. She didn't need to. The silence between us said everything. I left Lexan the next morning with a single box, papers I'd kept as a ledger of justice, and a worn notebook where I'd written her exact words, the day she cut my bonus. As I passed the security desk, the guard didn't look up. People avoided eye contact. Perhaps they expected some dramatic scene. Maybe they hoped the protagonist would be a different person. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Trains were late. Coffee cooled. Life continued its ordinary momentum around an extraordinary fracture. I didn't celebrate. I didn't shout. I walked down the street, the notebook heavy in my bag, my steps steady. Inside me was a quiet that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with survival. I had taken back my name. I had exposed the lie. But the cost, so visible in closed offices and unemployed colleagues, stayed with me like a shadow. Justice, I realized, is not a clean arc. It is messy and expensive and human. As I crossed the boulevard, I closed my eyes for a breath and let the calm settle. The storm had passed. The wreckage remained. And beneath the quiet, something else began to hum, an awareness that power, once given away, could be reclaimed. Not with spectacle, but with patient precision. The morning after Lexan's bankruptcy announcement, the city's skyline looked different. Maybe it was the fog rolling off the river, or maybe it was me seeing it all through new eyes. The glass towers that once felt untouchable now looked fragile, like mirrors that could shatter at the faintest crack. I sat at my kitchen table, sunlight pooling over the same worn notebook where I had mapped out every step of my revenge. The pages were creased, smudged with coffee rings and late-night tears. For the first time in months, I didn't need to write anything. The story had written itself, start to finish, pain to purpose. Victoria's downfall was complete. The headlines ran for days. Corporate fraud scandal exposed, executive faces federal investigation. Her photographs were everywhere, once symbols of success, now reminders of how arrogance can rot brilliance from the inside out. She'd gone silent, her LinkedIn scrubbed, her old colleagues whispering her name like a curse. But I didn't check the news for satisfaction. I checked it to remind myself of the truth, that I didn't destroy the company. She did. I had just turned on the lights. In the weeks that followed, Lexan's offices emptied one by one. I stayed long enough to help the honest ones find work elsewhere, to send references, share contacts, smooth the chaos that followed collapse. For the first time, people looked at me not with pity, but with quiet respect. Some even whispered thank you when they packed up their boxes. It was strange, being both the reason something ended and the reason others could start again. But that's how truth works, it breaks before it rebuilds. One afternoon, as I was leaving the building for the last time, I saw her. Victoria. Standing near the loading dock, dressed in black like the world owed her mourning. She didn't see me at first. Her hair was pulled back, her expression unreadable, her phone pressed to her ear in what sounded like another desperate plea. When she finally turned, Our eyes met across the concrete. For a second, it was as if time folded in on itself. All the board meetings, the quiet insults, the fake smiles, they flashed between us in a single, silent exchange. She didn't speak. Neither did I. But I saw it, the thing I'd waited for without knowing it. The flicker of realization. She finally understood that the woman she once humiliated, the replaceable employee she underpaid and dismissed, had outplayed her in her own game. And I felt nothing vengeful. Just peace. I walked past her without a word. No smirk. No gloating. Just silence, the kind that says, you don't deserve a final line. Weeks later, I started my own consultancy, small, focused on ethics and workplace accountability. I called it Reclaim Strategies because that's what I'd done, reclaimed myself. Every morning, I walked into an office I built with my own two hands. No politics, no manipulation, just purpose. My team was small but loyal. They respected not just what I'd survived, but how I'd turned survival into strategy. Clients came in cautious and left inspired. Many were women who'd been silenced, overlooked, or betrayed. They didn't need perfect systems, they needed someone who understood what betrayal does to the human heart and how to rebuild from it. And me? I had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that revenge isn't about destruction. It's about revelation. It's not about making them suffer. It's about making yourself free. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that day, the meeting room, the faces frozen in disbelief, the quiet sound of justice unfolding in real time. There's a poetic symmetry in how it all ended. Victoria cut my bonus to save money for herself. I exposed her fraud and cost her everything she ever valued. What she saw as punishment, I turned into purpose. What she took from me, a few $1,000s, I returned multiplied in dignity, freedom, and power. Money fades. Titles vanish. But self-respect? That's a currency no one can steal. If you're watching this right now, wondering if it's worth standing up, if it's worth fighting back, listen to me. It is. Not because revenge feels good, but because truth deserves to breathe. Because you deserve to stop doubting yourself. Because your silence will only feed their power, but your courage? It will set the story straight. And maybe your justice won't look like mine. Maybe it won't end in courtrooms or headlines. Maybe it'll be quieter, a life rebuilt on your terms, free from the people who underestimated you. That, too, is revenge. That, too, is power. So tell me, have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? Did you fight back or walk away stronger? Share your story in the comments below. I want to hear it. And if my story reminded you of your own strength, don't forget to subscribe, because this isn't the end. It's just proof that sometimes losing everything is how you finally win.